July 24th, 1965, 1400 hours, Red River Delta, North Vietnam. The four F-4C Phantom IIs of the 47th Tactical Fighter Squadron screamed across the sky at 500 knots, their afterburners leaving white contrails against the deep blue of the afternoon. Their target was the Dien Bien Phu munitions factory, a key node in the North Vietnamese war machine. For the American pilots, it was another day at the office, another mission in the seemingly endless air war against an enemy who refused to give up. They were confident, cocky even, secure in the knowledge that they were flying the most advanced fighter jets in the world, armed with the latest technology and backed by the full might of the United States Air Force. What they didn't know was that the rules of the game were about to change, dramatically and irrevocably. As they approached the target, their radar warning receivers, normally silent during these routine missions, suddenly shrieked to life. A new, unfamiliar signal was painting them, a signal that their electronic warfare officers had never seen before. It was the unmistakable signature of a fan-song guidance radar, the heart of the Soviet-made SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missile system. Before the pilots could react, 3 telephone pole-sized missiles erupted from the jungle below, climbing at Mach 3.5 on pillars of smoke and fire. The lead Phantom, piloted by Captain Roscoe H. Fobair, was hit directly and disintegrated in a massive fireball. The other 3 aircraft, their pilots stunned and disoriented, broke formation and dove for the relative safety of low altitude, their bombs jettisoned, their mission forgotten. The age of American air supremacy over North Vietnam was over. The SAMS had arrived, and the war would never be the same again. The introduction of the SA-2 Guideline into the Vietnam War was a carefully calculated move by the Soviet Union, designed to counter American air power and provide a much-needed boost to the beleaguered North Vietnamese. The missile itself was a marvel of 1950s Soviet engineering, a 2-stage liquid-fueled weapon that could reach altitudes of 60,000 feet and speeds of over 2,500 miles per hour. It was guided by a sophisticated radar system that could track multiple targets simultaneously and guide up to 3 missiles to a single aircraft. The SA-2 was not a new weapon. It had been used to shoot down Gary Power's U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union in 1960 and another U-2 over Cuba during the missile crisis of 1962. But its deployment to North Vietnam in the spring of 1965 represented a major escalation of the conflict, a direct challenge to American air power that could not be ignored. The Soviets, working in secret with their North Vietnamese allies, had spent months building a network of well-camouflaged SAM sites around Hanoi and the key port city of Haiphong. These sites were protected by rings of anti-aircraft artillery, making them incredibly dangerous to attack. The missiles themselves were stored in secure bunkers, and the launchers were mobile, allowing the North Vietnamese to move them from site to site in a matter of hours, creating a deadly shell game that kept American pilots constantly guessing. The initial American response to the SAM threat was a mixture of arrogance and disbelief. U.S. intelligence had been aware of the SA-2's existence for years, but they had underestimated the speed and scale of its deployment to North Vietnam. They had also made a critical political miscalculation, assuming that the North Vietnamese would not dare to use the missiles for fear of provoking a massive American retaliation. The Johnson administration, wary of escalating the conflict and potentially killing Soviet technicians working at the SAM sites, had placed the initial installations off-limits to American airstrikes. This policy, born of a naive hope that restraint would be met with restraint, would have disastrous consequences. It gave the North Vietnamese the time they needed to perfect their tactics, train their crews, and integrate the SA-2 into their already formidable air defense network. By the time the first American planes were shot down in July 1965, the SAMs were fully operational and ready for war. The psychological impact on American pilots was immediate and profound. For the first time in the war, they were facing a threat that they could not see, a threat that could reach out and touch them at altitudes that had previously been considered safe havens. The SA-2, with its massive 288-pound warhead, could destroy a fighter jet with a single hit. Even a near miss could be fatal, as the missile's proximity fuse would detonate the warhead, sending a cloud of shrapnel tearing through the aircraft's thin aluminum skin. The pilots, who had been trained to fight a war of dogfights and bombing runs, were now forced to contend with an enemy who fought with radar beams and computer calculations. The sky, once a symbol of American freedom and technological superiority, had become a deadly trap, a three-dimensional chessboard where a single mistake could mean instant death. The initial American attempts to counter the SAMs were a dismal failure. On July 27th, just 3 days after the first shootdown, the U.S. Air Force launched a massive strike against 2 known SAM sites near Hanoi. Of the 46 F-105 Thunder Chiefs that participated in the raid, 6 were shot down, and many more were damaged by the heavy concentration of anti-aircraft artillery that surrounded the sites. To make matters worse, it turned out that both sites were dummies. The North Vietnamese had moved the real missiles and radars to new, undisclosed locations. The Americans had risked their most advanced fighter bombers and lost 6 of them, all to destroy a few pieces of plywood and bamboo. The incident was a humiliating lesson in the realities of fighting a technologically sophisticated and tactically astute enemy. It was clear that a new approach was needed, a new kind of warfare that could counter the SAM threat and restore American control of the skies over North Vietnam. That new approach came in the form of the Wild Weasels, a group of volunteer pilots and electronic warfare officers who were tasked with one of the most dangerous missions of the war: to actively hunt and destroy North Vietnamese SAM sites. The concept was simple but terrifying. The Wild Weasels would fly specially modified F-100 Super Sabres and later F-105 Thunder Chiefs directly into the heart of enemy air defenses, deliberately baiting the SAM sites into turning on their guidance radars. Once the radar was active, the Weasels would use sophisticated electronic equipment to pinpoint its location and then attack it with anti-radiation missiles that would home in on the radar signal. The motto of the Wild Weasels was "First in, last out," and they lived up to it on every mission. They were the first aircraft to enter the target area, clearing a path for the strike fighters, and they were the last to leave, making sure that any remaining SAM sites were suppressed. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the Weasels and the SAM crews constantly trying to outwit and outmaneuver each other. The Weasels developed a complex set of tactics, with names like the SAM Break and the Troll, designed to evade incoming missiles and give them the few precious seconds they needed to launch their own weapons. The North Vietnamese, in turn, developed their own counter-tactics, turning their radars on and off in short bursts to avoid being targeted, and setting up elaborate ambushes with multiple SAM sites, firing in coordinated salvos. The air war over North Vietnam had become a high-stakes duel between 2 of the most technologically advanced military forces in the world, a duel that would push men and machines to their absolute limits. The technology of the Wild Weasels was as innovative as their tactics. Their primary weapon was the AGM-45 Shrike, an anti-radiation missile that could detect and home in on the signal from a Fansong radar. The Shrike was a revolutionary weapon, but it had its limitations. It had a relatively short range, and it could be fooled by enemy countermeasures. The Weasels also relied on a suite of electronic warfare equipment, including radar homing and warning, RHAW gear, that could detect the presence of enemy radars and identify their type and location. This equipment gave the Weasels a crucial advantage, allowing them to see the enemy's electronic order of battle and plan their attacks accordingly. But the most important piece of equipment in the Wild Weasel arsenal was the human brain. The Weasel crews were some of the most experienced and highly trained pilots in the Air Force, men who could make split-second decisions in the most stressful and chaotic environments imaginable. They had to be experts in everything from aerodynamics and weapon systems to electronic warfare and enemy tactics. They had to be able to think like their enemy, to anticipate their moves, and to react instantly to any new threat. The Wild Weasel mission was not for the faint of heart. It required a unique combination of courage, skill, and intellectual agility that few men possessed. The North Vietnamese, however, were not idle. With the help of their Soviet advisors, they constantly upgraded their air defense network, deploying new and more advanced versions of the SA-2 and developing increasingly sophisticated tactics to counter the Wild Weasels. They learned to use their radars in short, unpredictable bursts, making it difficult for the Weasels to get a lock with their Shrikes. They set up ambushes, with multiple sites firing in coordinated salvos to overwhelm the Weasel's defensive maneuvers. They also began to integrate their SAMs with their extensive network of anti-aircraft artillery and MiG fighter jets, creating a layered and redundant air defense system that was incredibly difficult to penetrate. The skies over Hanoi became known as the Ring of Steel, a deadly gauntlet of missiles, flak, and fighters that tested the courage and skill of every American pilot who dared to enter it. The losses mounted on both sides. The Wild Weasels, despite their skill and courage, suffered some of the highest casualty rates of the war, but they also inflicted heavy losses on the North Vietnamese, destroying dozens of SAM sites and forcing the enemy to constantly adapt and change their tactics. The air war over North Vietnam had become a brutal war of attrition, a technological and tactical stalemate where neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The turning point in the SAM War came in 1972 during Operation Linebacker II, a massive bombing campaign designed to force the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table. For 11 days in December, American B-52 bombers, supported by hundreds of fighter jets and Wild Weasel aircraft, pounded targets in and around Hanoi and Haiphong. The North Vietnamese responded with everything they had, launching over 1,000 SAMs in a desperate attempt to stop the American onslaught. The skies over Hanoi became a scene of unimaginable chaos, with missiles streaking through the night, bombers dropping thousands of tons of explosives, and fighters engaging in swirling dogfights. The Americans lost 15 B-52s and 11 other aircraft during the campaign, but they also inflicted devastating damage on the North Vietnamese air defense system. The Wild Weasels, flying the new and improved F-105G and F-4G, were instrumental in this success. Armed with the new AGM-78 Standard ARM, a larger and more capable anti-radiation missile, they were able to destroy SAM sites from a greater distance and with greater accuracy. They also benefited from new electronic warfare pods that could jam the Fansong radar, making it difficult for the SAM crews to track their targets. By the end of the campaign, the North Vietnamese air defense network was in shambles, and the government in Hanoi had no choice but to return to the negotiating table and sign the Paris Peace Accords. The legacy of the SAM war in Vietnam is a complex one. For the United States, it was a painful lesson in the limits of air power and the dangers of underestimating a determined and technologically sophisticated enemy. The SA-2 had challenged American air supremacy in a way that no other weapon had before, and it had forced the U.S. military to develop a whole new generation of tactics and technologies to counter the threat of surface-to-air missiles. The Wild Weasel program, born of desperation in the early days of the war, became a model for future suppression of enemy air defenses, SEAD operations, and the lessons learned in the skies over North Vietnam would be applied in every subsequent American conflict. For the North Vietnamese, the SAMs were a symbol of their resistance, a testament to their ability to stand up to the most powerful nation on Earth and fight it to a standstill. The SA-2 and the men who operated it had become heroes of the revolution, symbols of Vietnamese courage and ingenuity. The Ring of Steel around Hanoi had held, and in doing so, it had helped to secure North Vietnam's ultimate victory. The human cost of the SAM war was immense. Hundreds of American pilots were killed or captured, their lives cut short by a weapon that they had initially dismissed as a minor threat. The Wild Weasel crews, in particular, paid a heavy price for their courage, with a casualty rate that was among the highest of the war. On the North Vietnamese side, thousands of soldiers and civilians were killed in American airstrikes, and the country's infrastructure was devastated by years of relentless bombing. The psychological scars of the war would last for generations, a reminder of the terrible price of conflict in the modern age. The story of the SAMs in Vietnam is not just a story of technology and tactics. It is a story of human courage, human sacrifice, and the enduring human will to survive in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a story that reminds us that even in the most technologically advanced wars, it is the human element, the skill of the pilot, the courage of the soldier, the determination of a people to defend their homeland, that ultimately decides the outcome. The lessons learned in the skies over North Vietnam continue to shape military doctrine and technology to this day. The development of stealth aircraft, like the F-117 and the B-2, was a direct response to the threat of sophisticated air defense systems like the SA-2. The proliferation of surface-to-air missiles to nations around the world has made SEAD a critical mission for any modern air force, and the tactics and technologies developed by the Wild Weasels are still being used and refined today. The duel between the aircraft and the missile, which began in the skies over Vietnam, continues to this day, a deadly dance of technology and tactics that shows no sign of ending. The stunning arrival of the SA-2 in 1965 was a wake-up call for the United States, a rude awakening from the dream of technological invincibility. It was a reminder that no weapon is absolute, that no advantage is permanent, and that even the most powerful nation on Earth can be humbled by a determined and resourceful enemy. The pilots who flew into the ring of steel around Hanoi learned that lesson the hard way in a trial by fire that forever changed the face of modern air war in Vietnam and the future of aerial combat. The individual stories of the Wild Weasel pilots paint a vivid picture of the courage and sacrifice required to fly into the teeth of the North Vietnamese air defenses. Men like Colonel Robin Olds, a triple ace with combat experience in World War II and Korea, led from the front, flying his F-4 Phantom into the most heavily defended areas of North Vietnam. His aggressive tactics and innovative leadership were instrumental in developing the strategies that would eventually defeat the SAMS. Captain Merlin Dethlefsen, an F-105 pilot, earned the Medal of Honor for a mission in which he deliberately drew fire from multiple SAM sites to protect a flight of B-52s, his aircraft heavily damaged and his wingman shot down. Major Leo Thorsness, another F-105 pilot, earned the Medal of Honor for a mission in which he destroyed 2 SAM sites and then, despite being low on fuel and ammunition, engaged and shot down a MiG-17 that was threatening his wingman. These were not isolated incidents. They were representative of the courage and dedication displayed by Wild Weasel crews on a daily basis. They flew into the fire, knowing that their chances of survival were slim because they believed in their mission and in their comrades. They were a special breed of warrior, men who combined the skill of a fighter pilot with the intellectual rigor of a chess master, and their legacy is one of courage, innovation, and sacrifice. The North Vietnamese SAM crews were equally dedicated and resourceful. They were not the faceless automatons of American propaganda. They were skilled technicians and soldiers who had been trained by Soviet experts and who had adapted their tactics to the unique challenges of fighting a war against a technologically superior enemy. They worked in incredibly difficult conditions, living in underground bunkers and constantly moving their equipment to avoid American airstrikes. They were masters of camouflage and deception, using dummy sights and decoys to lure American pilots into traps. They were also incredibly resilient, able to repair and replace damaged equipment with remarkable speed. The SAM crews of North Vietnam were a formidable opponent, and they earned the grudging respect of the American pilots who flew against them. The war in the skies over North Vietnam was not just a contest of machines. It was a contest of human will, a duel between two groups of highly skilled and dedicated warriors who were fighting for their beliefs and their way of life. The technological arms race between the Wild Weasels and the SAM crews was a microcosm of the larger Cold War conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Americans were constantly developing new electronic warfare pods, new anti-radiation missiles, and new tactics to counter the SAMS. The Soviets, in turn, were constantly upgrading the SA-2, providing the North Vietnamese with new radars, new guidance systems, and new missile variants that were more difficult to jam and evade. It was a high-stakes game of technological leapfrog, with each side trying to gain a temporary advantage before the other could develop a countermeasure. The skies over North Vietnam became a testing ground for the latest military technology, a laboratory where the theories of electronic warfare and missile defense were put to the ultimate test. The lessons learned in this deadly laboratory would shape the development of military technology for decades to come, and the duel between the aircraft and the missile would become a central feature of modern warfare. The human element was always the deciding factor in this technological duel. The most sophisticated electronic warfare equipment was useless without a skilled operator who knew how to interpret its signals and make the right decisions in the heat of battle. The most advanced anti-radiation missile was useless without a pilot who had the courage to fly into the teeth of enemy air defenses and get within range of the target. The most powerful SAM was useless without a crew that had the skill and discipline to operate it effectively under the most stressful conditions imaginable. The war in the skies over North Vietnam was a reminder that technology is only a tool, and that it is the human beings who wield that tool who ultimately determine the outcome of any conflict. The Wild Weasels and the SAM crews of North Vietnam were both masters of their craft, and their duel was a testament to the enduring importance of human skill, courage, and determination in the age of technological warfare. The legacy of the Wild Weasels is not just one of technology and tactics. It is also a legacy of courage and sacrifice. The men who flew these missions knew that they were flying into the most dangerous skies in the world, and they did so with a quiet professionalism and a deep sense of duty. They were not seeking glory or personal recognition. They were simply doing their job, protecting their comrades, and serving their country. Their story is one of the great untold stories of the Vietnam War, a story of a small group of men who made a big difference and who helped to change the course of modern air warfare. The stunning arrival of the SA-2 in 1965 was a shock to the American system, but the response of the Wild Weasels was a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the American military. They had been stunned, but they had not been defeated. They had learned, they had adapted, and they had ultimately prevailed, leaving a legacy of courage and innovation that continues to inspire fighter pilots to this day.